As you may well have noticed, and I even noted this in the discussion for this week, I like to tie in the works of the Victorian era with the people, the predecessors, the genres that went before them, or the eras, I guess I should say, that went before them, and connect them also to more modern literature. And in this video, I want to talk a bit about the predecessors of aspects that we see in the Goblin market. Now, the Goblin market is by far my favorite Christina Rossetti poem. It just, I really do enjoy it, not only from the artistic point of view and her use of words, but the symbolism that is within the poem that connects to other aspects. And as you know, I'm a mythologist and I have a passion for myth. And those aspects are what I want to discuss in this video as they relate to setting the stage for the action in Christina's poem. And of course, in the poem, we have two sisters, Lizzie and Laura, and I'm probably going to get them confused as we go along. And they are tempted by the goblin men and the food. And it is the food that is the important aspect here. But before I discuss the food, I want to discuss another aspect of this poem that relates to Greek myth and also other religions and myths as well. And I'm going to start with the Greek. In Greek mythology, there is the goddess Demeter and her daughter Persephone. And if you're familiar with this myth, Persephone is abducted by her uncle Hades and is taken to the underworld. Now, Demeter searches for her daughter and she refuses to give up the search, and she is aided in her search by Hecate, who is the crone. And those three goddesses, Persephone, Demeter, and Hecate, represent the triad of goddesses, the maiden, mother, and the crone. But that's a diversion, and that really doesn't apply to this topic at hand, even though you know I am prone to rambling. But Demeter refused to give up on her daughter, and she felt so strongly about getting her daughter back. She defied Zeus, and she caused the first winter to happen. And Zeus commanded her, people are starving, I hear them crying, let the earth be fruitful. And she refused until she could have her daughter back. So finally Zeus acquiesces and said she can come back to her mother, come back to the surface of the earth, as long as she has not eaten any food of the dead. And the prime food of the dead was the pomegranate. And this is for several reasons. And one of the biggest reasons is because the pomegranate juice is like blood. And blood was the life force, and the dead craved blood. When Odysseus consults Tiresias in the underworld, he gives the shade of Tiresias blood, because that was the only way he could get Tiresias to speak. And when the dead drink the blood, then they feel alive again until it passes through their system or whatever it does in dead people. But Persephone, who has eaten nothing while she is in the underworld, finally gives in, and she either eats 3 or 5 pomegranate seeds, depending upon which variant myth you read. And so she's done the unbelievable, and Zeus says she can't return to the upper world, because one of the immutable laws of the universe is when you're in the world of the dead and you do what the dead do, then you are caught there. But after some negotiations, it is agreed that Persephone can live with her mother for part of the year, but she has to stay underground for part of the year. And you're saying, well, Gwen, how does that relate to the Goblin market? Because Lizzie is willing to sacrifice herself and go through these the temptation that is presented to her by the goblin men in order to save her sister. And she never gives up on that idea of saving Laura. And she does. Just like Demeter saves Persephone, or saves her at least for 6 months out of the year. So this theme of sacrifice and self-sacrifice is found throughout mythology, and we also see it in Christina Rossetti's poem, The Goblin Market, and this is myth, folks. It's all myth to me. We also see this idea of self-sacrifice in the Christian scriptures, of course, when Jesus goes into the wilderness and he is tempted by Satan, and he's offered all sorts of things if only he will give in and renounce who he is and so on. And Jesus refused to do it. And the outcome there is actually not so different than either Persephone or Lizzie's sacrifice, even though Lizzie doesn't die, sacrifice for Laura, in that Jesus is put to death, but he resurrects. And in his resurrection, he gives Christian believers the chance to live again. Just as Persephone is given the chance, and just as Laura is given a chance to revive or to resurrect, even though she's not physically dead. So that is a part of some of the lore that influenced Rossetti's poem. Did she know this? I don't know. Certainly that was a well-known myth, and there is other poems about Proserpina, who is Persephone, which shows that the pre-Raphaelite poets were very cognizant of Greek myth. But at any rate, that is one aspect of this poem that is related to mythology and what has gone before the pre-Raphaelite brotherhood. But what I really wanted to talk about is this aspect of food. Persephone is tempted by food, and she is so hungry she gives in. Even Christ is tempted by bread and water when he's fasting in the wilderness for 40 days, but he doesn't give in. The goblin men tempt the human women with food. Now, the goblin men are nothing to look at. They are goblins. And if you've read George MacDonald's Curdy and the Princess, you know the one thing that sets goblins apart from humans is they don't have any toes. So if you ever see anybody who doesn't have any toes, beware. But the goblin men attract the women with these luscious, luscious fruits. This is also symbolic of the Hebrew scriptures, because what tempts Eve? It is the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And it wasn't an apple. It could have been a pomegranate, could have been a fig, or it could have been more likely a fruit that we don't have, because after all, it was a tree of knowledge of good and evil. So food as a item of temptation is very strong. And there is a lot of repetition about the types of fruit that these goblin men were offering the girls, and were also would have been offering other women, probably in particular. And there's something very sensual about this, about these fruits that they are offering. And I'm not going to go into that, but that's a whole nother rim about the sensuality of the food. Now, so we have this association with food in the Greek myth, food in the Christian scriptures, but in Celtic lore, and the idea of the fairyland is directly related to the myth of Persephone and Christina Rossetti's myth of the goblin men. In fairy lore, the fairies, the land of the Fae is in the hollow hills and the barrows under the earth. Where is Hades? In the earth. Now, the Fae differ from the deities of the underworld, such as Hades, and they differ from the shades, the ghost, in the souls of the people who are in Hades. But there still are those connotations of being hidden and being within the earth. Now, Jesus is also entombed, it is within the earth, but eventually he rises and ascends to the Sky Father. But back to the Celtic lore. A mortal, a human, can visit the fairy world. And we often hear of myths, stories about humans who do go to the land of the Fae, and time is different there. People will be there what they think to be a day, and when they come back to the upper earth, they find that they've been gone for 100 years. So time is different. Special time is different between in the hollow hills and what we see on earth. And we often hear of these myths where the mortals are not allowed to return to the underworld. And it is most often because they eat the food of the Fae. Persephone eats the food of the dead, and eating the food or the drink that the Fae offer you is just as bad. And this is what has happened in the Goblin market. Even though Laura is not descending into the hollow hills or the barrows where the Fae would live, she succumbs to that, and then she is addicted, she is hooked. And it takes the intervention of Lizzie to save her from her fate. So we have all of these myths being used in the Goblin's market in the aspect of the undying love of sisters, or mother for daughter, or father for son, or just parents for their children. And we see that in the modern world as well, when parents will not give up on trying to find their missing children. And we have this aspect of the food, which is very important, obviously, because the food symbolizes more than just getting something to eat. The food becomes an addiction. The food becomes how the Goblin men, how Hades, and how the fairy in particular lure humans, lure mortals, and trap them in their own world or their own sphere. Now, why the Fae would want to do that? Varying reasons. Sometimes they fall in love with mortals. Sometimes it's just out of malice. And sometimes maybe it is even to save a mortal. I want to say more. I want to talk about changelings, etc., but this is not applicable to the Goblin's market. And so I am going to stop there. But I hope this sheds some light about the importance of food and why the food was so prominently displayed and used as a tool in this poem.